Hello, welcome to HRA Geopolitics channel. Today we have a new episode here, and I have an honorable guest, Rich Outzen, with me. And I'm very happy to see you again here, Rich, to speak about United States foreign policy and the recent developments inside of the United States regarding the elections and the possible relations between Turkey and United States in the foreseeable future. It's very good to see you here again. Hello.
It's good to be with you.
So, if you allow me, I want to start very soon with the questions, because there are many questions regarding the United States and the recent developments over there. The people are interested here. Of course, we are talking about the superpower, and especially in the last years, the deteriorating relations between the Turkey and United States. And people are curious how the recent developments will affect these relations. But first of all, the question will be about the internal politics of the United States. The sudden withdrawal of Biden, it was expected from experts, especially in the United States, but still it came as a shock around the world that this happened just short time scale before the elections. So what do you think has brought his withdrawal from the candidacy? You think there was any pressure inside of the Democrat Party, or that was something usual, what to expect in the United States? And right now, especially the talk about going around the Kamala Harris as the final candidate, what do you think the Democrats will deliver in the elections, and maybe if they win the elections, for the foreign policy? That will be my first questions about the Democrats.
Sure. Well, good to be with you. And I'll preface my remarks by saying that my views are entirely my own. I'm a retired military officer and have worked in government, and I'm a fellow at the Atlantic Council, but my views reflect my personal assessments and not those of the U.S. military, or my former employers, or the Department of Defense, or the Atlantic Council. So that said, it's almost unprecedented that we would have, after a primary election in which the Democrats picked Joe Biden as the candidate, that just sort of a few months after that, we have him sort of forced into withdrawal from the race. And he was forced into withdrawal from the race. The camp right around Biden, in terms of his family and his close advisors, said right up until the day he withdrew that, no, this is not going to happen. He's going to stay in the race. He's going to be the candidate. And in fact, many of the same people who called on him to withdraw 2 months or 3 months prior to his withdrawal were saying, this is the smartest, the most sound, the most healthy Joe Biden that we've ever seen. Well, that was clearly not true. Joe Biden was not a young man, I believe 80, 81 years old. Nobody is the best they've ever been at that age. And it was clear, certainly to people that were not in the Democratic camp, that he was having problems physically and cognitively in certainly the last year or two. But you can go back, I think, even before that, and say that there were some issues there. So the campaign in 2020, like it appears the campaign in 2024, is not being played out in the usual way. The role of COVID in changing how politics were done is significant. Certainly that had a lot to do with why Biden was allowed to become the candidate and really win the election in 2020 without the normal degree of vetting and argumentation in terms of debates and public scrutiny that you would see. So there is a chance, and I think the Democrats would like to repeat this formula with Kamala Harris, that there will also be an attempt to keep her out of public scrutiny. And by that, I mean, bare minimum in terms of debates with Trump, try to keep all of the attention focused on Trump, and not to have serious interchange or critical examination of policy positions. The policy positions are not mainstream by the United States standards. Both Vice President candidate Tim Walz from Minnesota, and Kamala Harris herself are well to the left of center by the American political spectrum. You can look at this at law enforcement issues. You can look at this in terms of national defense and foreign policy. You can look at it in terms of the economy. transgender issues, all these sorts of things. They're well left of where polling says the center of balance is for the United States. Of course, for us as geopolitical analysts, yourself and myself, the real issue is what happens with the exercise of American power if that team gets in. Well, certainly with regards to the Middle East, I think what we would see is the continuation of the Obama-Biden approach to the Middle East, which is sort of a hands-off. The United States does not want to be the architect of everything that's going on in the Middle East and would prefer to have sort of a partnership, if you will, with Iran. And that's what the Obama and the Biden administrations essentially have done behind the scenes through deal making with Iran and through taking a very soft approach to Iranian activities in Syria and in Iraq, Red Sea, the Houthis and so forth. Delisting the Houthis, for instance, early in his administration, Biden was signaling we're not going to really go after Iran's proxy groups. And so a little bit more critical of Israel. Of course, I know in Turkey, as a result of the war in Gaza, the criticism of Israel has reached a sort of a very high level as well. So there might be some overlap on Israel between your Turkish listeners and the Democrats on this. But certainly it's a little problematic for Turkey with regards to the Iranian role in the region. So I think in terms of my view as a critic, of course, and we all have our political views. I try to be analytic and also open about my own positions. I'm a critic of this administration's foreign policy. I feel that they have misplayed escalation dynamics and misunderstood geopolitics in sequential manner on Afghanistan, not understanding how the drawdown would play out with regards to the Taliban and the previous government, the Karzai government. Sorry, it was the Ashraf Ghani government. It was previously the Karzai government. I think not understanding how to deter Russia from going into Ukraine, or not making it clear that the United States was going to really stoutly support Ukrainian defense. So, for instance, we were arguing, in 2017, 18, 19, 20 in the United States Congress about whether the United States should provide lethal aid, so very deadly systems to Ukraine for its defense. Meanwhile, Turkey was providing Bayraktars and other lethal aid, so it was well ahead of the decision making. And I think that this comes from the misguided idea from our current administration that you have to avoid antagonizing Russia. Whatever you do, don't make it look to Russia like you're going to escalate, because then they'll be even worse. Well, what that does is it caps your friendly side's escalation, so that the aggressor, in this case Russia, knows exactly what risk it can take, because it knows how far your punishment will go or not go. So as a geopolitical matter, I feel like that's a little bit of malpractice. And therefore, I think what you'll see that will be a perception in the Middle East and in Europe of U.S. indecision if the Democrats win, a little bit more of sort of a weak and tepid response to deterrence. Now, on the other hand, if the Republicans win, if Trump wins, there is this personal factor of Trump and him putting the stamp on foreign policy that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on who the country is in question, right? And for Turkey, for example, the idea that there's a close personal relationship, or there has been and can be again a close personal relationship between Erdogan and Trump, that they understand one another, presents certain opportunities. On the other hand, President Trump, of course, was quite frankly punitive towards Turkey in a couple of instances, putting on economic sanctions as a result of the Pastor Brunson episode, and also after Turkish military operations in northern Syria. And he wrote a very undiplomatic letter to President Erdogan that was then leaked to the press. So what you get in bilateral relations from a Turkish perspective, if the Republicans win, has a bigger upside, because there's a sort of a sympathy and a willingness to engage on the basis of alliance dynamics. But there's also a huge risk because of the highly personalized nature of both men's approach to foreign policy. So that's probably enough of an answer for that one.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the insights. When we come back down to the Republicans, you mentioned some of the important points of that. There is, maybe you are following Turkey politics very closely. I'm also following your insights. It's always very informative. And I think very less people actually from the United States understand the internal dynamics of the Turkey, like your expertise. That's why to make a comparison or a depth analysis, most probably you see, I don't want to generalize, but there is a more euphoria about the Trump presidency in Turkey, because like you have mentioned, the personal relations, especially Trump's dynamics are, more personalized, going to person relation, especially also with Erdogan and other politicians. And he's acting more like a businessman in international politics, like, I give you one, you give me one, like that. Very simplicity. But there are also, downward trends, like you have mentioned, Pastor Brunson's situation, the Katsa, what was, used against Turkey. Of course, it was the last minute action from Trump. Some people have said he wanted to pressure the Democrats by going away as the president, but or maybe the economic financial attack tweets that was understood like that in Turkey. But there are these positive views about Trump. But when we look back, I remember the Syrian operation when Turkey went in, if you remember, with YPG. And there was this talk about the corridor. And at the beginning, Trump has told us, like, it's not my business. We were there for nothing. And I don't want to put my soldiers over there on the ground. And it's over. They should just fight out their beef. But then just several hours later, if you remember, the Congress was really, really angry, not only on the Democrat side, but also on the Republican side. And people screamed in the Congress for more sanctions, etc. So in that regard, especially when you see also the Turkish deteriorating relations with Israel and the human tragedy and the word fights going on. And Trump is right now in the campaign, like any before president, a bit also advertising himself. I'm more the friend of Israel than Biden is or Kamala Harris is. Do you think we can build just the constructive relations to solve our complex problems with the United States just because Trump is there? Or you think it is again going down to the state-to-state relations where Congress is a part, Pentagon is a part, or maybe lobby groups are a part of it? What do you think about that? Should we be positive about Trump so much, or just calm down and break a bit? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably safe to say that some of the frictions in U.S.-Turkish relations are structural. And regardless of whether it's Democrats or Republicans running the government, those are going to remain. And for instance, we have a structural mismatch right now between the U.S. counterterrorism policy in Syria and Turkey's counterterrorism priorities, because we're focused on the Islamic State and therefore have this instrumental or proxy relationship with the YPG, which is an offshoot of the PKK. And we've actually subordinated our entire Syria policy to that. By the way, I'm very critical of that approach. I feel obviously that it's caused big problems with Turkey, but it's also prolonged Assad rule in Syria by falling into his trap of making it all about ISIS, when ISIS is a symptom rather than the driver of the big problems there. So that's going to persist regardless, at least for a little while. Now, I also think that whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, I think ultimately we will have a military withdrawal from Syria. And before that happens, there need to be some serious conversations between Ankara and Washington about how that looks, right? Because neither one of us wants a total collapse of authority in those regions. None of us wants, or neither of us wants, a resurgence or a new level of Iranian control. Can you imagine a situation in northeast Syria where the YPG is under the tutelage and the control of IRGC, right? And working hand in hand with Hezbollah? That would also be a sort of a very bad situation for the people of Syria as well as for Turkish geopolitical interests. So, that file may not be as easy to resolve one way or the other. Now, I want to give even though I tend to support the Republican side in my personal politics, I'm going to give the Democrats a little bit of praise here by saying that the team that has worked the Turkish relationship and the U.S.-Turkish relationship under the Biden administration has had some real strengths. The ambassador, Jeff Flake, has been a very strong ambassador. He worked with the Senate and got approval ultimately for the F-16 deal. Of course, Biden had to personally intervene in that as well to get the F-16 deal in exchange for NATO accession for Sweden and Finland. Now, and when trust levels have been so low between the United States and Turkey, to get a deal like that, which is transactional, but still an effective and good deal for both sides. And by the way, got some concessions from Sweden as well with regards to how they're behaving on the PKK, certainly at least the way their legal structures are set up. That took some effort. And I think the first instinct of the Biden administration was to be hands off and not to call Erdogan, not to talk to the Turks. But they did through Victoria Nuland and Yuri Kim, other diplomats, as well as Jeff Flake. They ended up having the renewal of strong substantive strategic communications. And we've seen actually some very good things like the opening of a cooperative ammunition production arrangement in Texas between a Turkish firm, Repcon, and General Dynamics, so that now a good portion, a little bit over half of all U.S. 155 millimeter artillery ammunition by 2025 will be produced by this Turkish firm operating together. So there's been some good things. Now, there's also been some bad things, and those frictions will continue. I don't think that if the Republicans win, it's going to be sort of a panacea or an immediate solution to all the problems in the bilateral relationship. Certainly the Turkish concerns over the presence of Fethullah Gulen in Pennsylvania won't change overnight. The relationship with the YPG won't change overnight, although there might be a new opening, sort of to look at how the U.S. ultimately transitions out from that. I think on Ukraine, it's interesting. The Turks have played a very interesting position by both supporting Ukrainian defense very strongly, but at the same time not really alienating Russia. I think there's some in Washington that have been frustrated by that would have liked to have seen Turkey take stronger stance against Russia, for instance, on sanctions and things like that. But to be honest, I think the Trump position is probably closer than the Biden position is to Turkey's position on this, which is that, look, at some point, this war needs to end, and probably through a negotiation. It's not going to end with either a outright collapse of the Ukrainians or the Russians. It just should end through negotiations. And so I think that there's going to be some common ground there. I think in general, with the disposition of a businessman, Trump will look for deals to make with Turkey, and he has other priorities. It's not that Turkey is on his top 5 list of international or foreign policy issues, but I think he likes to have Turkey on side, and so for that reason, I would expect a pragmatic approach if the Trump folks are to win. To be honest, on the other side, with Joe Biden gone, there'll be, in some sense, a fresh start if the Democrats win. But Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are not giants in foreign policy. These are both people who don't speak foreign languages, don't have extensive overseas experience, have not done a ton of negotiating with or analysis of international affairs. So I don't know where they'll go. If they leave sort of the decision making in the hands of the same team that's been doing it for the Obama folks and for the Biden folks, then I think you'll see pretty much a continuation of the current Democratic policies. And there's some very good, very professional people, Jake Sullivan and so forth. And I think they understand the importance of Turkey. But there's an old saying to wrap up this question in the United States that personnel is policy. So when you've got two sort of novice politicians at the top of the ticket in Kamala Harris and Tim Walz on foreign policy, it will matter a ton who they have as National Security Advisor, Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of State to understand how this is going to be, how it is going to shape up. I will say that with Bob Menendez gone from the Senate, because he has formally resigned now, that one of the big obstacles, at least on the legislative side, to rapprochement between Turkey and the United States has been removed. So there is room for new growth.
Thank you very much. I have a very maybe controversial question. You are free to answer it how you want, but it amazes me how we arrived at this point of US foreign policy, not regarding Turkey, generally for the world, especially in a time where we have so many problems and hot points around the world, be it on the South China Sea, the Ukraine crisis, the human tragedy, what is happening in Gaza, the Middle Eastern problem with Iranian proxies, and many other problems going around. And the United States, as the sole superpower, at least for a portion of time during the Cold War and after that time, and now rising China is an obstacle for many people or many foreign policies. when I look back, especially in the 80s and 90s, uh, I see there, of course, internal politics differences between the Democrats and the Republicans. But in their approach, in a general sense, to the foreign policy, to the state-to-state relation. For example, I remember from Ronald Reagan from the Republicans and Bill Clinton from the Democrats. They were not so much apart, and they had a specific understanding of the world. I don't know if it was a more intellectual time or groups of people who ruled over the United States foreign policy, or I don't know what have changed exactly. But when we look today in the election race, of course, there is right now Trump and Kamala Harris, and before it was Biden. But when, at least me as a person, when I put them on a weight, it is not the United States I remember in the 70s, 80s, 90s. This how we took them serious and how they took our problems serious and understood how Turkey and the region is working. For example, recent example, um, the approach of the Democrats during the time of Biden to the enormous problems around the world was very weak. And on the Trump side, I remember the previous 5 years, he was maybe talking a lot on Twitter or making more approaches and action in the words, but at the end of the day, there was no solution to the complex problems. Um, is there any problem in the state apparatus? I mean, the advisors or the intellectual groups in the United States have changed in the shape, or what do you think as this right now what we are facing with the United States? Because people are in fear if it's Kamala Harris or Trump. They are not. They don't know what will happen after the elections exactly. In past, it was not like this. We were more sure what the Democrats will bring on the table and what the Republicans will bring on the table. What's your personal opinion about that?
Yeah, well, that's a complex question, and there's a couple of ways to answer it. The first thing I would point out is that we need to remember the United States has a long history, relatively long history since 1776, and it has not always been the case that we were looked upon as a global organizer or intervener. As a matter of fact, for the first 100 years, of course, through the 1870s, at least, we were very focused on internal expansion, the closing of the frontier, sort of developing the country further. We had this major civil war in the 1860s. So whenever people say, oh, it's never been this bad in terms of polarization and division in the United States, I have to point out we fought a war in the 1860s that argues otherwise. It was only really in the 1880s and 1890s we started to get overseas possessions after war with Spain. And so we Puerto Rico and the presence in the Philippines and the Hawaiian Islands and things like that. And then we became a quasi-imperial power, but certainly by no means the most powerful of the quasi-imperial powers. This was a time in which certainly Great Britain, France, Germany, Russia to an extent, the Ottomans, of course, were in decline. And then after the War of Independence, the very young Turkish Republic was not a major player as it was recovering from its own wars, but there were other movers and shakers. It's really only that period of, and by the way, we disarmed after World War I for the most part. So in the 1920s and early in the 1930s, very small overseas or international presence. We were not shaping the international system. That all changed with World War II. And for this period of time that is not typical of our whole history, between 1941 and the end of the Cold War in 1991, for 50 years, we mobilized. We mobilized first for World War II and then the Cold War. We became world leaders in science and technology. We shipped people all over the world, and we essentially, when the world was in shambles after World War II, and all of the major economies had suffered grievous losses of population and of industrial plant and things like that, we led the world to a significant economic and international recovery. And we set the grounds or the bounds for the new system, the Bretton Woods financial arrangements, the United Nations, and all those sorts of things. So this was a fantastic burst of activity in which the United States basically trained all of its people to say, we have to worry about the rest of the world, and we have to lead the rest of the world. Well, turns out that can be pretty exhausting too, right? So by the end of the Cold War, there was the sentiment already that, okay, there needs to be something new, some new world order. We can't go fighting wars all around the place. And of course, in the 90s, there were tremendous peace negotiations when we were trying to bring democracy through peaceful means and globalization, trying to bring China into the family of nations, trying to bring Russia into the fold of the West, helping new NATO countries. And then 9/11 happened. And 9/11 sort of had this very strong effect on the American psyche, making us very ready to hit back, right? And less high-minded and more inclined to use force and hard power to try to change the world instead of this sort of soft power and approach to globalization. And that brought us to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then sort of we exhausted ourselves with those. The American people got sick of trying to do those things. We saw the Arab-Israeli peace process fail, even though we had multiple presidents involving and investing a tremendous amount of energy in it. We had the war in Libya, in which we said, okay, Europe, you lead. And that didn't work out very well either. We stood back and Gaddafi was overthrown, but then chaos ensued for another 10 years. And we had the war in Syria, in which essentially nobody led. And the United States initially said, Assad must go. And I think that, to one extent, marks the end of a period when Obama said basically, yeah, I didn't really mean it. So we don't really mean Assad has to go. And then it became a much, much reduced American scope of ambition in terms of foreign policy. And I think that I would date it to that time, 2012, 13, 14, where both Republicans and Democrats basically said, look, we've tried everything. We tried wars in different places and occupation. We've tried wars without occupation. We've tried financial incentives. The world is simply unmanageable. Another factor, and by the way, this is all about the American psyche, right? And so why the United States no longer wants to manage these regions. And this is about how the popular views are, but it's also about the elites. The elites, I think, have also become more fragmented and more fractured because our political system is more polarized. During the Cold War, there was a rough consonance of opinion across the Democrats and Republicans about the need to defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War and to keep our allies on side and to make certain sorts of deals. Now, in the Democrats, you had a conservative wing of Democrats who were defense Democrats, sometimes referred to as blue dog Democrats, pro-defense and social conservatives, but that still voted with the Democrats on other issues. You also had some Republicans who were socially liberal, but pro-defense. So there was a coalition there that spanned both parties that was willing to be internationalist and interventionist. That's gone because basically conservative Democrats have become Republicans and liberal Republicans have become Democrats. Now the parties are much more ideologically homogenous and there's less deal making across the parties. That's another impact of this. And then let's not forget also that the world is simply a more complex place now. What we've seen with the rise of China and India as more than billion population states with massive economies. Look, 40 years ago, there was no or only a very small Chinese middle class. There was no or very small Indian middle class. These people now are engaged in politics. They've changed economic power, production power, consumption power, soft power, the way that people communicate. It's much, much harder to lead now. And Turkey is another great example. In Turkey, there was basically one set of decision makers on strategic and foreign policy that the United States could correspond with during the Cold War. It was the military and the secular elite that was aligned with the military. And basically everybody else was sidelined from serious strategic commentary or dissent or from a role in decision making. So if we convinced the military and a small number of political parties or political leaders to do a certain thing was going to happen, well, that all became much more complex as what's referred to as the military tutelary stage of Turkish government ended. And then we had nationalists and we had the AKP, which was a different sort of, it's evolved over its 20 years, a different sort of coalition of forces. We have many more people, and generally all of them skeptical of American power, right? Whether you're talking about Islamists or the nationalists or the left, very few people in the Turkish political spectrum instinctively want to follow the American political lead on international affairs. And what we've talked about, these wars in the Middle East and the current war in Gaza, have inclined the Turkish public even less to say the United States is the natural leader of the community to which we belong. So you play that out in different regions around the world, and I think you see that It's an America who, after generational change, is not sure. It would like to be the primus inter pares. It wants to be the leader of the world, as in first among equals. It still wants to set global norms, but it does not. It's no longer the generation that says we will bear any burden and pay any price for global leadership. That's not the America we're dealing with. We're very distracted by our internal politics, and we're tired from that kind of leadership at the end of the 20th and start of the 21st century. And the world doesn't want us to lead in that way anymore. Now, so people who watch geopolitical systems like you and like me understand that to have an organizing power, if not a global hegemon, but to have someone who at least can be looked to put together effective coalitions to effectively deter or to effectively compel in extremis, that these are important things. So I would agree with you. The United States has not been effective even as a primus inter pares under the last, 4 and arguably a little bit longer number of years. And that's why the globe has gone from disorder to even more disorder in a number of different places. That's why Iran and Russia and China and Venezuela and the Bolivarian states have essentially they've constructed a counter international order that flouts the rules and opposes most of what we would understand as the international norms and standards. So I would like to see a return to still modest but very focused use of American power. I'd like to see an America that's not afraid to swing its weight around, not afraid to stand for certain things, but is careful about how it puts together coalitions. And to me, this is the single most important thing: management of alliances. We did it well during the Cold War, but it takes a lot of time and you have to listen. Certainly with regards to Turkey, this is one of the key lessons, that we need to listen. We have a tendency as Americans to go to Turkey once we've had our conversation domestically and we know our policy and we know our strategy, then we send somebody to Turkey to go convince the Turks to support this. Well, that's not the right sequence. The right sequence should be, first you go to Turkey, find out what they want and what they can accept. Then we come back and then we make our strategies. And then we essentially have buy-in because we've built our strategy or shaped our strategy already with some understanding of what Turkey's limits, what Turkey's must-haves and must-not-haves are. And that's how alliances work. You do that sort of consultation prior to making the big strategic decisions, and then you coordinate moving forward. So I would like to see that sort of exercise of American power. I still believe American power is a good thing for the world when properly used. I'm not one of these restrainers, as you'll hear that term used in the United States, people who think, look, this is so messy that it's just best if we stay out of it. Let China and Russia figure things out in their parts of the world, and the Middle East, leave that up to other people, and we just stay in Fortress America and kind of do a little bit of balancing offshore. I don't buy that. I still think we need to work through alliances to be a key shaper pretty much in most of these regions of the world, but we need to be more modest about what we think we can do, and we need to be more effective in how we cooperate with others to do it.
Well, I have my own critics against the United States, sometimes very harsh, and I think I'm right in this sentiment, being about especially the situation in Syria with the YPG and the F-35 issue and many other things. But when I have to compare it and say, well, then tomorrow we will work just like some people are thinking in Turkey and other new developing world, then we will work with the Russians or the Chinese. No, that's not gonna work. I mean, there is absolutely nothing being economical or military sense or understanding that fits the Turkish narrative or the Turkish geopolitics in general. But then when I go back and make an analysis about the recent developments in the last 10, 15 years with the United States, like you have mentioned, yes, that was a good idea that the Americans maybe come and ask what we want or other nations want and what their plan is. There is much talk, for example, China is the rising power and the United States must stop them on economic basis or military basis. But then again, just to look from Ankara, I would get really anxious about that. Why? Because the United States itself is not clear about how to tackle China, or if they really want to tackle China. Because if yes, there are so many points, for example, where you can work together with Turkey, be it in in close areas, or Central Asia, or maybe with the rising Turkish navy in the Pacific in near future. But there are no real thoughts, but the opposite. We have even problems to get sometimes spare parts for defense technologies and developments. I mean, that's very normal that the Turkish person, average person, thinks, well, the Americans want us to go very hard against Russia, but how to do when we have so many complex problems with the United States and the recent situation, for example, in 2015, what we have lived with the downing of the Russian jet, and the answer of Obama, if you remember to that time, it was very soft from the Turkish sense, like thinking, oh God, maybe the Americans will not rush to our help. It's not like in past. So how we should trust or any nation in that fight, or like you say, I believe the same. There must be some order, at least from some level, in this alliance, when we call it alliance under NATO umbrella or whatever in the region. But then, what is the clear goal from our ally, United States, exactly? Because it is changing every 5 years with sentiments, and the reaction what they show against Turkey. Um, the people are not sure if they really want to engage Russia or China or anyone for the common interests. Do you think there is any misunderstanding of why we arrived at this point?
Yeah, well, so China is so big. I mean, just with such economic and population resources. And by the way, it's not the first power in the world, and there are some reasons to think that it may go into serious decline in the latter half of the 21st century. For instance, demographic decline. They have big problems with the one-child policy and sort of the outcomes of that over time. Some estimates say that the Chinese, who are still 1.2, 1.3 billion, may be as low as 700 million or 600 million in population by the year 2100. So they've got some serious demographic problems. They have some economic stagflation problems, this is not a country that is of unlimited power, resources, and growth potential, but they're still a very major power, and they're so big that you have to ask yourself the question: is it smart to seek out conflict with them? And that's why in the United States, there's this search for a nuanced relationship in which we have economic relations, and yet we also deter China from doing certain things, because it's also unmistakable that China conducts industrial espionage against the United States, that it has absolutely tried to inflict damage to the United States through the introduction of fentanyl on purpose, sending drugs into the United States, that it engages in unfair trade practices, and that it has worked to undermine U.S. allies such as India and Japan and other places. And they make no secret of the fact that they want to eject the United States from the Pacific. We are a Pacific power, and yet they do not want the United States to be a significant strategic player in their region. So yes, they have a target on us, and I don't think it's in our interest to go after them to try to fight a Cold War or to try to fight a war, but we need to make sure that we strengthen U.S. allies, and I would include Taiwan in that category, and Japan, Australia, Korea, India, others, and we should encourage Turkey to do so as well, although I know that Turkey-India, for instance, is a complicated issue because of the Turkey-Pakistan.
Because Pakistan relations, it's, yeah.
So yeah, we can't, there's this old saying in the West about you can't be more Catholic than the Pope. We should not ask Turkey to be more Catholic than the Pope, so to speak, on the issue of China. We can't ask you to be a bigger competitor or limiter to China's strategic ambitions than we are. But there are places, and I think you alluded to this, where actually it makes a lot of sense for us to work together. One is Central Asia. The United States does not want to see Central Asia come under Chinese economic, commercial, or strategic domination. Same in Africa. China's engagements in Africa have been described by a U.S. former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as acting like a global strip mining corporation. So that, the Chinese don't go in and give jobs to locals and do factory building and economic production. They bring Chinese people working in Chinese factories. They extract African minerals and other resources, and then they produce goods. The locals get a payout, but they don't really get to see the development that should come with all of that. So, yeah, I think that Turkey's engagement in Africa is fascinating because over the last 15 years, Turkey has more than sextupled its trade with Africa. It has more than quintupled its diplomatic representations in Africa. It has strategic relationships. It's helping not just with drones, but with defense and training in ways that help stabilize these countries. The Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, was on the verge of falling to the Tigrayan rebels when Turkey sent some drones that helped stabilize this. It's a Nobel Prize winning president whose life probably was saved as a result of Turkish willingness to cooperate and provide defense cooperation. So these are areas where, with a little bit more strategic consultation, the United States and Turkey can work together. So, for instance, U.S. funding for certain commercial activities in Central Asia. I'm trying to remember where it was. It's either in Africa or Central Asia, but there was a Turkish company that actually built the United States embassy. And there's other large, sort of economically interesting projects for both the United States and Turkey that, with a little bit of U.S. funding, can be done appropriately and collaboratively.
Yeah, I understand actually that the United States cannot be every time everywhere like we got to use in during the Cold War, and like the complex problems that you have mentioned earlier, which is happening internal of the United States, because people are also skeptical, especially after the war on terror. But especially the examples are very important, what you have given before, about Africa, about the Central Asia, where Turkey is unfolding its wings and trying to get their influence. And these are also the regions where the Chinese are fighting tip to toe to get ground and giving to the regimes enormous credits, and we can call like economic slavery, it is possible that for the United States to use exactly in these areas the Turkish soft power and encourage them more, but this need to be also shown with economic and military intentions. Like I have given the example that we have these problems in defense technologies and the whole thing about Katsa, etc. And then when we look to Central Asia, yes, especially maybe a Turkic union in the future will help to strengthen this against China, and China is very anxious about that. But then when we look to the United States policies, especially inside of the Congress, the speeches about the Karabakh conflict, you know very well, and the approach against Azerbaijan, and sometimes I'm really asking myself, what is there a common, in Armenian and United States relation, except, our friends in Glendale? I mean, what is there, anything, in the last 50, 60 years, what is there any togetherness between these two, especially when we think Azerbaijan is a close partner, and the United States was one of the first in the United Nations Security Council to condemn in the 90s what happened in Karabakh and expected the immediate withdrawal. But today we are talking, especially United States politics, as like Azerbaijanis are the occupiers and are against the international law. I know there is some part, of course, internal politics, of course, with lobby, etc. That's normal. That's happening also in other nations. But then when it comes high to the White House and they are giving the same speeches, it is really difficult for a Turkish person to believe, okay, the Americans are our friend and they are on our sides. So how do you think we overcome these misunderstandings in the near future? Do you believe that any new president, be it Trump or Kamala Harris, whatever, is able to get all this misunderstanding well down, and we can find a constructive ground again like in past, or this will just escalate more? What do you think about this?
Well, I don't think either one of those will happen. It's not going to be solved, but it's not going to escalate either. First of all, the functioning of lobbies and internal interest groups in the United States is constitutionally mandated. It was actually Alexis de Tocqueville, the French observer a couple centuries ago, who came and said, this is one of the strengths of the American society, is that not everything's run by the government and the state. People organize in communities, in their churches and local clubs, and they exercise political voice. Now they can do that through political donations and help fund campaigns. And it's not only allowed, but it's sort of one of the fundamental ways of how people get elected in the United States. So the problem, I think, when it comes to U.S.-Turkish relations is that there have been some domestic interest groups and lobbies that are very skeptical, Turco-skeptical, we can call them. And there has not been a big politically active Turkish diaspora in the United States. Now, there are Turks in the United States. They have been, in many cases, divided into groups that are sort of more secular, more religious, or pro-AKP, anti-AKP. There's the Gülenists. There's different groups here. There's not a single focused issue that brings the Turks in the United States together. Now, there is a rising percentage of Muslims in the United States as part of the broader population. I think what you'll see happen over several decades is that there will be more interest groups based on Muslim identity and perhaps on Turkic identity, and that will start to balance things out. But the other thing I'd point out is that there's a levels of analysis problem here. I mean, every state, and I think Graham Allison is the best at sort of talking about how these decisions within any state, Essence of Decision, I think was the name of his book, where he talks about this. There's kind of the unitary state actor model, where you imagine that there's a common rationality to a state, that it thinks geopolitically in the way that you and I do, and that it sees the logic and it will make decisions based on that logic. That does operate to a certain extent within the bureaucracy, and certainly in the mind of a president or a leader, but it's never the whole equation. There's also sort of the bureaucratic interests and competitions, and that's the people below the level of the senior decision maker that have their own power struggles. There'll be, for instance, in the United States system, of one view in the Department of State and one in the Department of Defense, something else altogether in the Department of the Treasury. Each of them sees the world through, and let alone the Congress, right? And so each of them sees the world through their own lens, and all of them are fighting to make sure that their voice is heard and that they set the agenda. And then you have organizational politics. You have within each of these organizations, you have the egos and the careers and the decision making of people trying to find the problems they want to solve, or in some cases to press their own solutions. So every day in the United States government, all three of these levels operate, and it's sort of a cacophonous or a semi-chaotic system, and it only coalesces for coherent decisions really when there's a crisis, or when there's a huge amount of executive level attention that's put into it. So I guess what I would say to people watching this is that, look, it's not a conspiracy theory. The truth is, ethnic and other interest group lobbies in the United States do have a lot of power, and the real way to being heard fairly is to operate by organizing your own constituents, I mean the Turkish Americans in this case, to exercise influence on their elected members in Congress, but also to work the other levels, to understand that if there is a bureaucratic element or a top level official or these local groups and lobby groups, if one of them is giving a narrative that's damaging to the bilateral relationship or trying to work against collaboration, you still have to stay engaged on the others. It's a multi-level chess game. So I think it's going to get significantly better in the near future? No, I think it's going to be a continued struggle. But we do have a sort of a model, if you will, or a template of what works. What worked in the 80s and then the 90s was a defense-focused relationship between the United States and Turkey, where there were big companies that made money together, where there were military people who understood one another and had collaborated together in the Balkans, for instance, in Bosnia and in Kosovo and in Somalia, where there were shared experiences between the government people involved, and a real effort on the part of some in the Congress and the legislature on both sides, and the big businesses on both sides, to bring people together. It took decades to recover from the late 70s. The late 70s were a very low point, I think much lower than we're at right now in the bilateral relationship after the opium
People
crisis.
don't remember, but it was low.
Yeah, that's right. It was very low. And it took 10 or 15 years of very, very hard work by both sides to bring the relationship back to a good level to which it was by the mid 90s. So we're not at that low point again, but we're at a pretty low point now after all the things that have happened over the last 10 years. I think it's going to take another 10 years of building up mutual trust and relations like that.
Thank you very much. I don't want to extend too much the program for you too, but there is one important question what many are asking. I know there is no easy answer for that, but I would be surprised about your perception. Especially people are asking about this F-35 S-400 issue. Do you think in foreseeable future, because there is this dream that to give up S-400s to any country and next day the F-35 will land in Ankara. So when I know the relations between the United States and military apparatus and defense companies and the Congress, all the parts, it is not that easy. But people like to believe in these kind of very short solutions. I don't think that Turkey is ready to just give up tomorrow S-400s. There are many other political aspect of that. But do you think there is any easy solution in the foreseeable future, be it on the democratic side, or like some people believe Trump will come and say, look, there is money for F-35, we want to earn, and just give it to Turkey. Do you believe that will happen, or there are still complex problems we need to overcome?
I think some of the damage of, and look, I get this from both sides. The Turkish view of the U.S. support to Israel during the Gaza war has poisoned the view of the United States for many Turks. Turks don't understand because they see the suffering of the people in Gaza and the deaths of the innocents there, and they essentially say, how can the United States let this happen? But on the other hand, it looks 180 degrees different from that in Washington, right? And to most Americans who have a very emotional bond with Israel, but kind of like it's sui generis. It's unlike the relationship with any other single country. And that's not because of an ethnic lobby. Really, it has a lot to do with sort of the religiosity in the United States and a feeling of camaraderie between Christians and Jews, but also just sort of a respect for the nation building project of the Israelis. So both in the United States and in Turkey, there's this very rooted and in some ways admirable view that leads to outrage at the other. And that's going to further damage trust on something like F-35. And so, I won't go into specific statements by different people, but let's just say that between Israel and Turkey, they have not spoken like friends since this war in Gaza kicked off. So if the assumption is that they're not friends right now, then the assumption in the United States Congress will be Turkey shouldn't have the F-35s. That's my view. Now, if the temperatures come down from what's been going on in Gaza, there's a long-term and a medium-term logic to Turkey getting the F-35s. It was an early in design partner and put money in. I think Turks are not wrong to feel that there was some unfairness to how the whole expulsion from the program went. And I've talked to people involved with the process who say it's not impossible Turkey could get back in. But there would have to be this sequence that you talked about. There'd have to be sort of a decrease in tensions bilaterally over the Gaza war. There'd have to be a little bit of creative outreach by legislators and businesses on both sides. Then the S-400s have to go somewhere. I don't think the S-400s are doing Turkey a lot of good at this point. And I think that Turkish air defense solutions, the Hisar and the missile systems and the short range gun systems, Turkey is better able to take care of its own air defense, and that will even continue to grow in the next 5 or 10 years. On the other hand, the F-35, I mean, it's fair to ask, does Turkey really need the F-35? It's an exceptionally expensive plane to operate. The Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, in a hearing, I think about 18 months ago, said this is a drive only on Sunday aircraft. It's that expensive to operate. And so is Turkey, which is one of the pioneers in unmanned systems, right, and working on the Kızıl Elma and these other things. Maybe Turkey is better off spending those, billions and billions of dollars on domestic systems. I don't know. It's not impossible that there could be a solution. I don't think it's going to be a near-term solution.
I think it was always forgotten, but some of our great neighbors, which we have great relations, getting them, making some people very anxious about it. But sometimes I'm also asking myself, that happened also in the 70s, 80s with F4. Some of them got it and the other was anxious and asked also for the same plane. Maybe in not near future, but in some years it can be offered again. But I agree with you wholeheartedly, especially not only because of the S-400, the rising tensions in the region, the word fights with Israel, and how the United States is understanding situation. And if we think that the United States policy is over the years always to giving the technological edge to Israel, all of this have to be thought. And that's also something what I try to tell the people. It's not that easy in foreign policy just to say give away the S-400s and get the F-35 tomorrow to Konya Air Base. It needs more work with the Americans, I understand. And yeah, that was also the last question. There are, of course, so many questions, but we cannot cover it all. So I'm apologizing to my followers. I try to make much use of the time. Thank you very much, Rich, that you were my guest today. It was, like always, very, very honorable to have you here. I hope in near future maybe we can meet about another session about the United States-Turkey relations. It's always great to talk to you and learn something new about the United States and the world in general. Thank you very much for joining.
Good to talk with you as well. Thanks.
Thank you. And guys, don't forget to follow HRA Geopolitics. I will have a lot of geopolitics and defense programs in Turkish and English. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye. Good evening. Bye-bye.